This is the Mondoweiss Podcast. I'm Dave Reed. Before we start this episode, a word of thanks. This is the 50th episode of our podcast, and we appreciate all of our listeners that have tuned in over the past year and a half. With the 50th episode, we're changing things up a little bit. The intro is shorter, we have some new music and sounds, and we're working on some new segments that will be added over the coming months. Let us know what you think of some of these changes and how we're doing by getting in touch with us through our website or send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Now, in this episode, our founder and senior editor Phil Weiss speaks to Matthew Teller about his new book, 9 Quarters of Jerusalem, a new biography of the Old City. The book mixes travel writing and history with the savage politics of Israel's treatment of Palestinians in a city loved by people all over the world. Teller is a British journalist who worked for years in the Middle East. His reports have appeared in the BBC, the Times of London, The Guardian, and many other places.
Well, Matthew, thanks so much for joining me for this podcast. I was excited to do this because I was in Jerusalem reading your book, The 9 Quarters of Jerusalem, a new biography of the Old City, just last month. And it was great to have the book with me. Jerusalem is one of my favorite places in the world. And it's clear from the book that it's also one of your favorite places in the world. And it's of course, for everybody who knows Jerusalem, it's an incredibly layered place. There's politics, there's culture, there's religion, there's art, there's just, all human activities. And I noticed for those of us who are drawn to Jerusalem, there's also Jerusalem syndrome, which I think you happily kept out of your book. It was in there at one point, but Jerusalem syndrome is this idea that I guess certain types are drawn to Jerusalem, and I think, which I think is true. Whether those types are political or religious, it certainly has a hold on the human soul. And your book just explains that, or doesn't. It just makes clear just what a rich, incredible place this is. And of course, your book is also political, and any visitor to Jerusalem is struck by the politics of Jerusalem. They're overwhelming in this period of its history. I suppose that's been true in other periods of its history, but in this period, they're certainly overwhelming. So in this discussion, I would like to have you, I want to explore the book with you and get to the politics. We're a political website chiefly, but I know that the politics are not frontal in your book, and I appreciated that about it, but they're very much there. And so I want to get to the politics, but I hope to begin by asking what hold this city has on you. You first went in 1980, I believe, to Jerusalem. So can you tell us a little about yourself and why you decided to do this book?
Yeah, I can. Wow, what an introduction, Phil. Thank you so much for that. And you're right about Jerusalem syndrome as well. I mean, Jerusalem syndrome famously pushes people over the edge. Mentally speaking. So, it's a place that not only attracts certain types of people, but then having attracted them, it then drives them crazy as well, which is a very interesting sort of twist. Trying to avoid and trying to stay clear of Jerusalem syndrome while I was writing the book as well, was a key thing for me as well. The first thing really that I want to say is that Jerusalem's not my city. And it never will be my city. I'm a visitor. I'm an outsider, as you said. The first trip that I made to the city was in 1980, when I was a kid of 11. And then in 1982, shortly after that, my father, amazingly enough, arranged for me to have my bar mitzvah twice. Once in the synagogue that we used at home in London, and again at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And I've been lucky to have been, coming back to the city and visiting and traveling and living and working for most of my life. But it's not mine. And it never will be mine. While I was researching and writing this book, I was very aware of 150 years, probably more, 175 or maybe even 200 years, of people like me, white, English-speaking, middle-aged, middle-class, well-educated, whatever, men, mostly men, claiming Jerusalem for themselves, or claiming Jerusalem for their nation, or in the British case, claiming Jerusalem for the empire, or sometimes claiming Jerusalem for their religion, Christianity. And then proceeding to tell everybody else, often at great length and often in print, why their claim matters, so very, very much indeed. That's not why I've done what I've done, as I hope, people can see if they get a chance to read the book. I wrote this book because I could see an imbalance in narratives about Jerusalem in my culture, English-speaking culture. Because of my work as a journalist, as a writer, I'm lucky to have a platform from which to speak. I wanted to use that platform to try and help to redress that balance. But, you'll know, I know, and I'm sure people listening will know, balance is a tricky word. It's a tricky concept as well. We hear it when in relation to the news media, and it conjures these images of a seesaw. It implies there are two sides. And here, very often, one side is Israeli, which is very often conflated with Jewish. The other side is Palestinian. And the wisdom runs, if you devote equal resources to both sides, the seesaw will end up level. You will have achieved balance, But as I try to set out to show in the book, Jerusalem has many more sides than two. It would be misleading to reduce Jerusalem just to two sides. The idea of two sides, also ideas about those two sides also being irreconcilable, are a fiction. And any balance that may result from treating two sides like that equally will never be an equitable balance, because Israel has the overwhelmingly larger proportion of assets, resources, status, power, money, visibility. The seesaw isn't level to begin with. So to achieve an equitable balance, you have to act unequally. So what I did in the book, rather than trying to approach with this idea of two sides and to take, equal numbers of stories about Jewish Jerusalem and Jewish people and set them against stories about everybody else. Yes. What I've done instead is to try and favor those who begin with fewer advantages. I'm trying to amplify the voices of the unlistened to, the 10% as against the 90%, if you like.
Yes. So just to break in on that and unpack it a little, as we say in the podcast, but let's unpack that.
Sure.
I took great pleasure in your portraits of a Dom person, what the word in Jerusalem for people of Gypsy heritage. That was great. There was the Indian hospice, I knew nothing about. And the Armenian, the rock star, Armenian rock star. So there were these narratives that are very different from, the simple bifurcation of Jewish and Palestinian, which I appreciated. But I'm wondering if, just to respond to what you said so far, when your caution about, Jerusalem is not yours, who does Jerusalem belong to?
That's a lovely question. Jerusalem belongs to the people who are there, I would say. I mean, I was very careful when I was writing this book to focus specifically on the Old City, which is, as I'm sure you know, and I'm sure people listening will know, is this the walled area at the center of the wider, sprawling city of Jerusalem. It's in the area that's been occupied by Israel. It's still behind its Ottoman era walls. It's where most of the holy places are. So I was focusing specifically on there rather than trying to look at the wider city, just because I felt that the material is so rich that if you start to look beyond, either the book would end up at 1,000 pages long, or I would lose my way. The whole project will have fallen to pieces. So I gave myself the restriction of focusing just on the Old City. But if you think just about the Old City, there are, the holy places are there. People visit. It was a motivation for writing the book as well. People visiting, and all through my teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, watching people like me come into Jerusalem, pilgrims, as visitors, tourists, and encountering the people who live beside the holy place that they're aiming for. So people come with this kind of mental tick box. I'm coming to Jerusalem to pray at the church. I'm coming to Jerusalem to visit the mosque. I'm coming to Jerusalem to kiss the Western Wall, whatever it is. And I don't think this is unique to Jerusalem. I think it happens in cities that are heavily touristed anywhere in the world. But people were encountering the locals who were kind of between me and my goal, my spiritual culmination, as being an impediment. So the people who are living and working and running their business or taking their kids to school or whatever they're doing in the Old City were becoming, like I say, an impediment, a hurdle over which I have to leap in order to get to the church that I want to get to. So you have a situation where the people are downgraded as being less important than the holy places. And I think that's an attitude as well that seeps over into policymaking. I don't think it's just about tourism. I think that attitude on the part of not only the Israeli authorities, but also external authorities to the people who live within the old city has been very negative and very damaging. So part of my reason for writing the book was to try and, as you say, unpack that and overturn it. And expose it for being, the disrespect that it is. Jerusalem, if it belongs to anybody, belongs to the people who live there. Those people inside the walls, there are 35,000 people roughly living in the old city, 90% of whom are Palestinian. It's theirs. It's theirs. And I think a discussion of sovereignty is also very, very interesting. When you look at Israeli claims to extend its sovereignty, the sovereignty of the state, over Jerusalem, and specifically over the old city, how in some areas, classically and most obviously Al-Aqsa, the compound that to Jewish Israelis is known as the Temple Mount, Israeli sovereignty over the Temple Mount, any sovereignty, any state sovereignty over the Temple Mount is, what's the word I'm trying to say? Very rocky. It's very loose. Israel cannot call the shots on the Temple Mount. Jordan also cannot call the shots on the Temple Mount. No single authority is able to. It's a combination of authorities who judge what action to take. But in essence, the compound is owned, controlled. It is sovereign in the hands of the Palestinian people who defend it, who are there daily, who live there and work there and pray there.
That's a lovely passage of your book, as I recall, where you say that you actually see people, they dictate the life of that site more than anything else, the people who are there. And I think that's the way I feel about not having spent a lot of time at Al-Aqsa, but but certainly Damascus Gate, despite every effort to
that's another great example,
change the architecture for security purposes, quote unquote, and put more and more
whose
soldiers
security
there.
is the question, but go.
It's a very Palestinian place, and you see a living culture there that is exciting. So I guess this, you're broaching political ideas, and I want to get at and obviously you're not shy about politics in this book. On the other hand, the storytelling, the historical storytelling, the delight in certain historical characters, like that guy Shapira who faked the Moabite relics.
What an amazing guy! What a character! What a life he led!
Yeah, and that was like the 1860s, or you take great delight in these historical tales, and yet there's also the politics. And I'm wondering how you, before we get into, the nationalist fever dream of Jerusalem, which sadly, is something that's very present to any traveler, Jewish or non-Jewish, who goes there, or Muslim for that matter. I mean, it's very prominent. But before we get into that, I'm wondering how you endeavored to balance in your book the travelogue and the politics. And you obviously have a historical gene in you. You enjoy this exploration, and there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, explaining the nine quarters, as you call it, and just describing the city is it's a wonderful task for anyone who visits the place. And so I'm wondering how you balanced that, and what your intentions were around that balance.
It felt quite natural, actually. It felt like the one comes from the other. The politics of today and the political issues that every Jerusalemite and every visitor to Jerusalem faces are bedded in the history of the place and the people who were there. It didn't feel like a leap to me to be able to blend history and politics in that way. That particular balance, worked very well in my head. I'm very glad that that it came across well, and thank you for the praise that you're giving as well.
It's a pleasure. The book is a great pleasure to read. I want to
thank you. That's very, very nice of you to say. The one example of that, as you said, is the quarters themselves. I mean, I can tell the story of the four quarters, where they came from, and what their significance is. it stems from, it was another motivation for me writing the book, actually quite a strong, coming as a tourist, every map that you see of Jerusalem, every tourist map, but any map anywhere, on the news media as well, and on the internet now as well, but divides the old city into four: Muslim quarter, Christian quarter, Jewish quarter, Armenian quarter. Mm-hmm. It's an absolutely standard designation for the old city of Jerusalem. It's taken as, absolute truth. And, very often you see these maps with very sharp lines of division, not just sort of area labels, but actually they will draw a line down between the Christian quarter and the Muslim quarter, and maybe even color code one against the other, as if these are separate political entities or something. But as you'll know, you'll know because you've been there, and if people are listening who, as you'll know, the city itself doesn't have these dividing lines. There is no line between the Christian quarter and the Muslim quarter. And the sense of exclusivity that these quarter labels engender in people who are approaching and visiting is quite wrong and is very misleading as well. There are churches in the Muslim quarter. There are mosques in the Jewish quarter. There are people living everywhere. But I was seeing that people approaching Jerusalem, for the first time, might imagine that these quarters are sort of holy. This is a holy city. Has it been divided holily into these holy quarters? It's a mistake. But then it's from that, it's then a short step to the next mistake, which is thinking that, as, say, a Christian visitor, am I even allowed into the Muslim quarter? Maybe I should stay away. This is not my zone. This is not my people. This is somehow enemy territory or something. It's all quite wrong, and it's quite mistaken. And these sorts of maps are a very Western conception, and they remind me of, like an atlas of Europe, where you have all the nation states locked together, or an atlas of the United States. There's a point in the west of the US where Utah and Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico all meet at a four corners point.
Very good. You did very well on that. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, four corners.
And exactly. if you look at that, that's like Jerusalem, sort of transplanted over. And then, I was thinking more when I went on I was doing a promo tour in the US over the last couple of months. And so I was thinking about this before I went. And you think more about it, is very instructive, because maps of the United States that show the four corners point where these four states meet erase an indigenous reality of the geography of the place that stems from, in that situation, the Navajo people or the Hopi people and other Native American tribes that live there. And these maps of Jerusalem with these four quarters, it struck me as well, are doing the same thing. They're erasing an indigenous reality of the old city by imposing this division on top. So, that's a very long preamble as to the research that I started to do as to where the idea of the four quarters came from. And there's a long story. With the cartography, the history of the cartography, Jerusalem goes back, you could spend hours talking about it, going back centuries. But to pick a point to begin with, all of the maps of Jerusalem up to the early 19th century were figurative. So Jerusalem was the sort of center of the world, center of the universe. That concept didn't exist, but you know what I mean. It was the navel of everything, which is drawn from a biblical reference. And images of the city were either completely figurative, kind of made up, invented as a sort of psychogeographical impression of how an individual or community, especially pilgrim community, would conceive of the place, or it was portrayed as a sort of European castle, some sort of fortified entity, which related to the mental image of the cartographer who was designing that particular map. So in about the 19th century, after Napoleon, when Napoleon invaded Egypt and then Palestine, he brought with him artists as well as military people. He brought artists and scholars and explorers and whatever, which caused this surge of interest in Arab and Turkish culture in Europe. And then shortly afterwards, we see the first map of Jerusalem, which is based on measurements actually taken in the field. And that came in 1818. And then you can trace through the early part of the 19th century through the maps that were produced. And you can identify how the city was conceived of by the European outsiders. So the early maps only showed, if they showed any quarter at all, they showed a Jewish quarter, a Jewish neighborhood. And you can look at later ones from the 1830s, and they start as Europeans start to encounter Jerusalem in a sort of deeper way. They become more engaged in who is living there and why they're living there and what the population is and what the history is. So you start to see labels for Armenian settlement, Greek settlement, Turkish settlement, as it was called, and other places as well. But still, there was none of this sort of division going on until the British arrived. So there was a whole load of political upheaval in the 1830s. There was a rebellion led from Egypt, which had challenged Ottoman rule. There was also a popular uprising in Palestine as well, which led to a power vacuum. So the European powers were jockeying for position here, trying in one sense to restore order and in another sense to exploit the instability to advance their own interests. Foreign consulates are opening in Jerusalem for the first time in this period, 1830s, early 1840s. And in 1840, there was a sort of a failed diplomatic initiative. As a result of that, Britain essentially bombed Palestine into submission, handed Palestine back to the Ottomans, but left its forces in place. So there was a team of British Royal Engineers who were in Palestine in 1840, surveying the coast and the lands, up and down the coast of Palestine. And then they went inland. And in 1841, 2 of them arrived in Jerusalem to start mapping Jerusalem for the first time. And this was coupled with also an influx of evangelical missionaries. So Britain and evangelicals across Europe had long wanted to try and convert the people of the Ottoman Empire who were unevangelized in their eyes. But they were unable to convert Muslims because Ottoman law stipulated death for people who converted away from Islam. They were unable to convert Catholics or Orthodox Christians, partly because there was little willingness in those communities to convert, and partly because France was protecting Catholic rights and Imperial Russia was protecting Orthodox rights. So if you start to mess with the communal balance, you kick up a diplomatic row, and Britain at that point wanted to avoid it. So we see British efforts going into converting the Jews. And so at this point in the 1840s, Britain, for its own evangelical reasons, needed to know exactly who lived where in Jerusalem. And we see the appointment of the first Protestant bishop of Jerusalem arrives in this time, 1842. With him was this young man, a chaplain, who was only aged 27 at the time. He was called George Williams. And he was only in Jerusalem just over a year or so. But he wrote a book. And in that book was a map. In 1849, it was when the edition was published. The map was taken from the Royal Engineers survey, which was done a few years previously. But Williams added all the labeling to it. And this is the first time that we see Muslim quarter, Christian quarter, Jewish quarter, Armenian quarter. So I think I'm the first person to identify George Williams and his map of 1849 as being the first time that we see these 4 quarters.
That was a great pleasure of reading your book, that history and your exploration and discovery. So, Matthew, how long did that map from the 1840s, has that persisted? Is that reified in our understanding of Jerusalem today?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's the basis of those tourist maps that I was talking about today. That division, the idea of the 4 quarters, you could ask, why has it survived? It survived because, of and I'm referring here to the work of an increasing number of historians who have looked at Jerusalem. Salim Tamari is one that comes to mind, Vincent Lemire, Michel Campos, Sarah Irving, Roberto Mazza. There are many others as well and their work is the foundation of anything that I've done. But as they're now showing, this survived because these 4 quarters suit the colonial ambitions of successive waves of the rulers of Jerusalem from then right down, to our own time. They're false. The quarters are false. They were imposed by a colonial power. They were invented by a 19th century British missionary. They always were false. But it suited Jerusalem's colonizers to divide the city's populations against themselves, to foster this kind of sectarian division. And it's incredibly damaging that it's lasted as long as it has. Tellingly, the quarters are not used by Palestinian Jerusalemites. They don't exist. Well, they exist in Arabic, but they're not in the regular everyday conversation of people in Jerusalem. They are a way to digest and to commodify the city for outside consumption. And, if one thing comes out of this book of mine, it's to say that, the quarters have had their time. Let's retire them to history and let's move on to different ways of conceiving of Jerusalem away from the damage that sectarian division has caused.
Great. That is a great theme of your book, and I want to get to it in a couple of minutes. The whole idea of partition is problematic in your book, and I want to get to that too. But first, before I get to those political philosophical issues, can you tell me a little about your efforts to promote your book in the United States and how that went? And what, to the extent that you have an appeal to Jewish audiences, religious audiences of any sort, how you were greeted by those communities in the United States?
It was fascinating, Phil. I was very, very lucky indeed. I had like 3 weeks or something going coast to coast. I think I spoke in 15 different cities over 17 days or something like that.
Wow.
Anyway, it was full on. I was in, Boston, and then I was in Chicago, and then I was somewhere in Nebraska, and then I was in Seattle, and then, it was like all over. It was really fascinating. You're right. I do, because of my background, and because of the work that I've done has given me this platform from which to speak. I do sense that privilege that I have in being able to speak to audiences who otherwise might not listen to the things that I'm saying. That's an amazing privilege to have. It's a very weighty privilege as well. I felt it a lot. There were times speaking to audiences in synagogues or Jewish community centers around the US where things did get heated. There was pushback. Some people were furious at what I said. And so, some of the things I was saying when I was talking about 1967, I was talking about, perhaps we can get to this story. This is another very instructive story about the Israeli demolition of the Moroccan quarter, as was in Jerusalem. Many people, I was going to say several people, but actually many people took issue with the politics behind that. Some people wanted to overturn my presentation of the politics and to say that I was decontextualizing and really Israel acted because of X, Y, and Z. From my perspective, all of it was fine. It was, I'm very willing to have people, in that sense, come at me. It's okay. I'm the guy on the stage. I am the guy with the presentation. I'm the guy who's written the book. I've got the microphone. I have the privilege already of being able to speak. If by what I'm saying, it's able to spark public debate, and if people feel as if they need to come at me and to challenge me, it's absolutely fine.
Of course.
It did get heated. There were times where people were tearful. People were genuinely, furiously angry at me and what I was saying. But it's okay.
So I want to frame this question a little bit by the fact that, your book has excellent interjections of history of both the Nakba and the 1967 war. There are moments, you're not a lecturer on this. You're not gonna, this book is not on its face that political, but it's very political. And you're not drumming this in, but we meet this guy at the Indian hospice, and the next thing you learn about his family being destroyed by an Israeli bombing. And you mentioned the Mughrabi quarter. I mean, the destruction of after 1967, you describe a lot of destruction that took place as Israel was trying to nationalize components of Jerusalem. So I bring this up not so much to delve there as to ask, what can you be a little specific about this is history that is familiar to us, you and me, as political visitors to Jerusalem, but can you be a little explicit about how this took people by surprise in America and what some of the specific anger was about these types of issues?
Yes, I mean, I can be. The Moroccan quarter is a particularly stark example of that, because there are narratives about what happened and why Israel did what it did there, which have really not been challenged. It's certainly not in mainstream discourse at all. So some of the specifics were also around terminology. I was using the term when I was describing what happened in 1948 in the Moroccan Quarter, where there was destruction, I'm very willing to tell the story. Actually, the story is of this alternative narrative of what happened there is another fascinating story. It is historical. It's shorter than the story of the quarters. I'm happy to tell it. But specifically, you asked about specifics. There's the period in 1948 when there was a lot of destruction, when the Jordanian forces were facing the people who I called Zionist paramilitaries in the Jewish quarter. There was a lot of destruction. The synagogues were destroyed, people were killed, people were displaced. And I remember there was one particular man in one of the places I spoke in the US who was bitterly angry at me for standing up in a synagogue wearing a kippah. When I'd started that particular talk, people had asked me to wear a kippah because I was in a synagogue. That wasn't my choice, but I acceded with what they wanted me to do. So he was furious with me standing up, wearing a kippah, and using this term Zionist paramilitaries, which he took as being a term of abuse. And I was, I said to him, this was pre-Israel. They were not Israeli. They were Jewish. They were Zionists. They were fighting on the Zionist side. There was not an army. So they were paramilitary. They were Zionist. It's a factual statement of who they were, and I think he took it as coming from me as being a term of abuse, which is unfortunate.
So Matthew, you're a worldly person. You've spent a lot of time reporting all over the world, and especially in the Middle East. Can you tell me what your impressions are of the American understanding of this, the Israel-Palestine question? You toured our country, my country. What is your impression? What do you carry away from this about the politics of the conflict in my country?
My impression is that most people, whether they're Jewish or not, have more or less fully absorbed the mainstream discourse as to what Israel is, why it exists, and what the Israeli authorities are trying to do. There was, as I said, shock, anger, some misunderstanding among general audiences when I was saying some of the things that I was saying, presenting. We talked earlier on about a 90-10 imbalance. When I was presenting the discourse, the narratives as being not 90-10 this way, but 90-10 the other way, people were very often confused. And I think it was challenging to their sense of what Israel is, even to some extent what Judaism is, but certainly what Israel is all about, why it exists, and what the United States is doing in supporting Israel to the extent that it is. There were other audiences that I spoke to. I spoke in the Palestine Center in Washington, D.C., and I spoke in, it's a very beautiful museum, the Palestine Museum in Connecticut, just outside New Haven. And there were other audiences as well who had absorbed other narratives already, who had absorbed the Palestinian narrative or the narratives that run against the mainstream sense of what Israel is all about, and they, in essence, were much more sympathetic, which is to be expected. You asked very specifically what my impression is of the United States and the people who I met while I was speaking, what their impression of Israel is. My impression is that it's, in fact, quite shallow. It's not based on first-hand experience most of the time.
Yes.
And tragically, where that experience is first-hand, because of that 90-10 imbalance, most people, if they do go to Jerusalem or they do tour the Holy Land, as it is called, they do so from an Israeli perspective. So, I started in travel writing. I'm a travel writer. I've written guidebooks and different things. Travel to that region is dominated, or to the space between the river and the sea, if you like, is dominated by the Israeli tourism industry, probably to an extent greater than 90-10, but certainly, within Jerusalem, there's one statistic I can give you. There are something like 12,000 hotel rooms in Jerusalem. Pretty much 11,000 of them are in hotels that are Israeli owned or Israeli operated. So you have this, not just a majority, but a vast, overwhelming majority of people who do have first-hand experience tend to be approaching the city, the people, the ideas, the places from one perspective.
Yes.
If I was to take away one thing from my time in the US, I guess it would be that, which is unfortunate.
I want to get to the 90-10 and the 70-30 and other numbers of race.
It's like an alphabet soup of numbers going on here.
Yeah,
but yeah,
in
go on, carry on.
Jerusalem. But just to persist in my American question, one more
Mm,
thing.
mm.
You know, I often say I'm so optimistic about where America's going. There are more people awakening to the real politics of this conflict, the imbalance, and Palestinian support for Palestinian rights is growing in the United States, and social media is transforming everything. Am I naive?
No, I don't think you are. I don't think you are at all. I think you're absolutely right. But I think it's coming from a base of so near zero as, in a sense, to be negligible. So the doubling or trebling or quadrupling, whatever, of awareness of Palestine and interest in the issue of Palestine may well be true, but it's coming from a base which is tiny. So there's a long way to go yet still. But I don't think you're naive, and I think that change is very tangible. I mean, even from here, I'm in the UK at the moment. This is where I live. This is where I work. It's that change in US sensibility is also tangible to me. It may be because I spend too much time on Twitter, but there does feel to be a change in mood and a change in understanding.
Yeah. Back to the numbers. I was a little surprised in your book to read that there was a national policy on Israel's part to try to maintain the population, the Jewish population of Jerusalem at 70-30 to non-Jews, 70% Jews, 30% non-Jews. Now, I know that Israel wants to Judaize both Jerusalem, the Galilee, other areas as it Judaized the lands that it took under partition in 49. But I didn't realize it was so explicit. And then when you talk about these hotel rooms, 11,000 of them being under Israeli, and Jewish ownership or Zionist ownership, that seems part of this sort of forcible Judaization. Can you elaborate? Did I read you correctly on this? And can you elaborate?
Yes, you did read me correctly. That is a policy, and it's a stated policy. It's been a stated policy for I think a generation or more. I wouldn't say that hotels are Zionist operated. I think it's very clear that they're Israeli. It's Jewish Israeli owned or operated hotels. But yes, that balance of population is maintained by policies that will be very familiar to you and also to many listeners as well. Less in tourism terms because tourists come and go, but much more in terms of the IDs that are given to Palestinian people and to Jerusalemites, Palestinians in particular, and the different privileges that they confer. This is, as you'll know, this is a difference between blue IDs and green IDs. Green IDs being the ID card issued by the Israeli authorities to Palestinians in the West Bank, has a green colouring and it comes in a little green envelope. And a different ID issued to Palestinians of Jerusalem is blue coloured and comes in a little blue pouch. It's one of the most egregious policies that Israel has maintained in Jerusalem, in particular since 1967, has been to withhold and withdraw residency rights from Palestinians for not having what's now called their centre of life being in the city. So you can be born in Jerusalem, your father, your grandparents, your great-grandparents going back however many generations you like. But in Israel's eyes, if you're Palestinian, you're still only a resident. You're given the rights of residency without citizenship. And a claim by Israelis, which is often made, is that Israel offers citizenship to Palestinian Jerusalemites, which is true, but it's conditional and it can be withheld, and very often is, or not granted at all. So whereas Jewish Israelis are given citizenship, and Jewish people also from outside Israel are given citizenship without any questions asked, without any conditions attached, other than to prove their Jewish identity to the Israeli authorities, which in itself is problematic, but we can come to that in a different conversation, perhaps. So the way that Israel is trying to maintain this ratio of population, 70-30, at the moment it's about, give or take, 65-35, is one of the ways is by controlling the issue and the withdrawal of these blue IDs. And that's been a policy which has been ongoing since 1967. There have been thousands of people who for one reason or another, have left Jerusalem or gone abroad to study or have family connections in the West Bank or whatever it may be, which means that they are deemed to have removed their center of life from the city. And so when they come to try and renew their ID card, then they find that their rights as a resident have been withdrawn and they're unable to go back and live in Jerusalem. And there are many other ways in which this policy is enforced. Another way is with house seizures, property control of various different kinds, and also house seizures by Israeli extremist militant organizations, which have the backing of the government as well. And we can talk about that too. But that policy of 65, we're currently, like I say, 65-35 is ongoing and appalling,
So
frankly.
Matthew, I am, the word appalling. I mean, I noticed that in your book, you are very good at controlling your emotions. You were not given.
Thank you. Not everyone has said that, Phil. So thank you for saying that. Some people have said the opposite, in fact.
I sense that, it's a very well written book, and
Thank you.
it's your determination to entertain and amuse and inform. That's there, and you seem. I guess what I'm asking is, how much outrage do you feel about this when you're there, and how did you feel about in your writing? How you're going to channel that outrage? Because for my sense, I'm a different kind of writer than you, but I'm a pretty emotional person, and and maybe I preach to the converted a lot more than you do. But I as they say, lean into my emotions on it, and I'm curious how you approach this question as a writer.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. What outrage do I feel? I feel crushing outrage. Every time I go. I'm sure that's not common just to me. I'm sure you feel that. I'm sure many other people feel that as well. Mm-hmm. Jerusalem is not a relaxing place to be. No. It's a very, very difficult place to be if you have any sense of what's going on below the visual surface. Even the visual surface is appalling enough, but if you have a sense of what's going on below the surface, it's 10 or 100 times worse. I struggled a lot with how to channel that outrage. Well, I mean, you can tell because I'm 53. And it's taken me this long to be able to squeeze out a book about the place. It's a very confusing and troubling place to be. I because of my background, the way I characterize it in my own mind is I spent 20 years in the beginning of my life as a child and as a teenager absorbing stories about Jerusalem and Israel and Zionism and my own Jewish identity coming from England as well, in all sorts of ways, with all sorts of overtones from my family, for whom Zionism was very important, very strong. A bond to Israel was very important to them and also very strong as well. When I became an independent adult, I was very lucky indeed to be able to move with the fortunate chance of having the passport that I have, British passport. It allowed me to move and to go to places, to listen to people who I hadn't met before, telling stories about these places that I thought I knew, but telling the stories from a completely different perspective and I was listening to new ways of understanding these places which had been of such importance to me as a kid. I was very lucky. I lived in Cairo. I've traveled in Jordan. I lived for a time in Jordan as well. I've traveled through the Middle East. In Syria, I listened to people in some of the refugee camps in Beirut. Mm-hmm. And I've since traveled through the Gulf and through various other parts of the Middle East and the world as well. And the way I characterize it is I had 20 years of one thing. I had 20 years of a completely other thing. And then it's taken me another 10 years of my life to sort of let all this mush around in my head, and to try and combine with that outrage and to try for myself to try and figure out a way to, as you say, to channel that outrage. It would be, I don't want to, I was going to say it'd be relatively easy. That's to decry other people's efforts and achievements. But it would be relatively straightforward, shall we say, to write a book of pure outrage and of pure anger. Mm-hmm. Other people have done it, mm-hmm. and my suspicion is they've done it better than I could. And what I wanted to do with this book, what I want to do in general is to try and find a way. I don't think, yes, you talk about preaching to the converted. There's a role for everybody
Yes.
in the field of certainly in the field of activism and in politics, but also in the field of literature and writing as well. There's a role for everybody to play, and everybody has different strengths.
Yes.
And if I do have a strength, I hope that it's one of being able, in this particular field, in talking about Jerusalem and Palestine, it's being able, as we said earlier on, to try and straddle camps, to try and be able to be heard by audiences who otherwise wouldn't listen to the kind of stuff that I'm saying if it came out of somebody else's mouth.
The process of undoing or resolving those first 20 years of instruction with the subsequent 20 years of experience, has there been personal grief for you in understanding the mythologies that you were raised with?
No, grief, not at all. It feels truthful to me. It feels like, particularly writing this book was a liberation for me, because I was able at last to say things that were right and true on my own account. Having done a lot of travel writing as well in the past, travel writing was the sort of way in for me. It was the door that allowed me into the whole zone of trying to think about how to write about these places. But travel writing comes with lots of strings attached, mostly, particularly when you're doing journalism, travel journalism for newspapers or magazines or the media. So this book allowed me to speak my truth, maybe not quite for the first time, but certainly for the first time in a substantial way. And no, there's no grief attached to that at all.
Thank you. That's great. That's a fantastic answer. And I just want to emphasize to listeners that Matthew's description of, for instance, the confiscation of the home that is now the Museum of the Seam near Mandelbaum Gate, a Palestinian estate, a beautiful home that is it Barakmi? The family has never been able
Baramki, yes, Baramki. Yep.
Never been compensated for. A beautiful story you tell. The story of Deir Yassin you tell, in the way in which you tell it is extremely effective.
Thank you.
So I feel like there are great episodes in this book within what might seem outwardly travelogue that are very helpful and descriptive and not over emotional about things that are appalling often. So
I'm so pleased that you say that, Phil. That makes me very happy. That's exactly what I was trying to do.
Well,
and for some people it chimed, and for some people it hasn't. But I'm very, very delighted that it did chime for you.
So a few more questions. One, I have to ask: have you gotten any pushback from your family about this book? If you don't want to go there, I will respect that, because
that's fine. It's okay. I mean, I can answer quite briefly. No, not really. They love me for who I am. We rarely now, especially with my father. My mother died a few years ago, but my father, we don't talk politics. We've sort of agreed that there's no benefit in going there for either of us. He's approaching things from 180 degrees, diametrically the opposite way from me. But he's still supportive and very encouraging and very loving, and there's been no pushback in that sense.
I want you to tell us briefly about Hezekiah's Pool, which is coveted now by Israel inside Jerusalem. Never heard of Hezekiah's Pool. And then I want you to conclude with a speech to me and to my listeners, our listeners, about why you think partition is traumatic. You say this idea, partition is this idea that has bedeviled certainly Israel and Palestine for 75, 100 years. But you also say that it just doesn't work. And part of your whole theme about dividing the city is just that that's not the way people live. And are you being idealistic about, obviously you are being idealistic, but I asked you to conclude with a speech about partition.
I will certainly do my best. Hezekiah's Pool is, or the Pool of the Patriarch's Bathhouse is its other name as well. It's a hidden place. If people know Jerusalem, if you come in the Jaffa Gate on the western side of the old city and you head straight on into what's now called David Street or Souk Harun, heading downhill. On the left-hand side there, behind the Petra Hotel, which has now been seized by extremists, extremist factions backed by the Israeli government. And also behind the left-hand row of shop fronts along that street is a very large, squared-off, rectangular pool, a reservoir which is connected to the Mamilla pool just outside Jaffa Gate to the west, which was also part of the ancient waterways which fed water into the city of Jerusalem. It's now disused, obviously, but you can go up onto rooftops or balconies and look down at it. It's not visible at all from any of the streets all around. You have to be on the back side of the buildings surrounding it in order to see it. But it's this large, empty, open space, which was for many years was filled with stagnant water. I think it's been cleaned out relatively recently. But yes, you talked about the Israeli municipality seeking it. They've been trying, I think, for several years to take it, to turn it into a sort of a public performance place, to pave it over and to turn it into a place for music concerts or other things, whatever. But they've been stymied at each turn because this is, I believe it's Waqf land. It's owned by the Islamic Waqf, who have resisted.
What's wrong with partition?
Oh my God, what's right with partition? Partition. Just looking at some of the examples of partition. I mean, by partition, let's be clear. What we're talking about is the two-state solution. So in this context, partition means creating two states alongside each other, Israel on one side and Palestine on the other side. But if you look at examples of partition, there are many, many, many. Korea in the 50s, Cyprus in 1974. There are loads of them. Brexit could even be called an example of partition. India is the obvious example. India and Pakistan in 47, and then Pakistan and Bangladesh in 71. Each time that partition has been imposed, millions of deaths have resulted. Trauma has resulted. There has never been a resolution satisfactory to both sides or all sides in any situation. Partition is a temporary, always has been, and in a sense always will be, a temporary solution to an issue of conflict. It doesn't do anyone any good. I think the evidence from history and from 20th century politics shows that. Why it shouldn't happen in this case, we're coming towards the end, so I don't want to go on a whole monologue about the two-state solution. But the two-state solution is rooted in a nationalist narrative which asserts opposition. It's about creating, not just creating, but embedding a binary. And as we talked earlier on about the binary, imbalance, the binary between Israeli and Palestinian or Jew and Arab or whatever, however you want to define it, all these binaries are flawed because, first of all, people don't think like that. But secondly, within each block, there are 1,000, 100,000 micro communities of opinion, which is partly what my book is trying to emphasize as well. So trying to create two states in order to be in opposition to each other, well, they would also, with the history that's involved, it would be impossible for them to begin on any sort of equal footing. It's hard to conceive of where even the territories might begin or end. I'm thinking about the Clinton peace plan of 2000, just before Bill Clinton left office, which involved, thinking again just specifically about the Old City, it involved a partition of the Old City to be able to give the Christian quarter and the Muslim quarter to the Palestinians under Yasser Arafat, and then to take the Armenian quarter and to tie it to the Jewish quarter, and then to give them to Israel. And so somehow, God alone knows how, there would have been an international border running down the alleyways through the middle of the souk in the Old City. Partition. I mean, as I say, I could go on. I'm going to keep it short. Partition is not a good idea for anybody. It would never, it can never work. It will never work. And we need together, and by together, I mean all of us, all anybody with a stake, we need to find a better solution, a better way out.
Well, it's a beautiful book. That was a beautiful statement by you, very moving. And you do get into the Clinton peace plan in the book itself. I recommend it. It's wonderfully written.
Thank you.
It's full of delight, and it also has great meaning, as you just evidenced. And Matthew, I appreciate your patience. Thank you so much. And I look forward to reading more of your work.
Thank you so much, Phil. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for your time, and thank you
pleasure.
for your insightful questions as well. It's been great.
That was Matthew Teller and Phil Weiss. Links to Matthew's new book, 9 Quarters of Jerusalem, a new biography of the Old City, can be found in the show notes. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, go to mondoweiss.net/donate. If you are not a subscriber to this podcast yet, click that button so you get every new episode in your app of choice. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Finally, if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.